Two parents were convicted of killing their own child. For years, that explanation was accepted. Then it collapsed. The convictions were thrown out. The evidence stopped making sense. And the story everyone thought they understood no longer held together. Because if the people blamed for this crime were innocent, then the investigation had been moving in the wrong direction. From the very beginning, a 4-year-old was taken from her bedroom during the night. No forced entry, no witnesses. What followed wasn't just a murder case. It was a series of decisions that left the most important truth still missing. The truth doesn't hide forever. From whispers to breaking news. This is Now You Know News, your front row seat to the world's darkest stories. Jaclyn Dowaliby was 4 years old. She lived with her parents in Midlothian, Illinois, a quiet suburban town just outside Chicago. People who knew her described her as energetic, affectionate, always wanting to be noticed. She attended preschool, played with neighborhood kids, lived the kind of life where danger isn't supposed to exist. There were no reports of abuse, no calls to social services, no history that suggested something was wrong inside the home. And that matters. Because when a child is killed, investigators often search for warning signs, patterns, something they can point to and say, this explains it. In Jaclyn's case, there was nothing like that. What happened to her didn't fit a story that was already written. And when that happens, people don't always change the story. Sometimes, they force the facts to fit it. On the night of September 9th, 1988, Jaclyn Dowaliby was put to bed by her parents. It was a normal Friday night. No arguments. No visitors. Her bedroom was on the first floor of the house. The window was closed. The screen was intact. Sometime during the night, something changed. In the early morning hours, Jaclyn's parents realized she was gone. Her bed was empty. Her blanket was still there. At first, they thought she might be hiding, or had climbed into another room. But every room was checked. Every closet. Every corner of the house. Jaclyn wasn't there. Police were called. Within minutes, officers arrived and began searching the neighborhood. What they didn't find was just as important as what they did. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no footprints outside the window. It looked like a child had vanished, without waking anyone, and without leaving a trace. Just a few hours after the search began, the focus shifted away from the house, and toward an open field not far from the neighborhood. It was a place people drove past every day. Nothing about it stood out. That's where Jaclyn Dowaliby was found. Her body was lying in the grass. She was fully clothed. There were no obvious signs of a struggle at the scene. For investigators, the location immediately raised questions. If Jaclyn had been taken from her bedroom during the night, how did she end up here? Without anyone seeing or hearing anything, there were no drag marks, no disturbed ground, no clear path showing how she got there. And then there was the timing. The area had already been searched earlier that morning. Officers had driven past it. Some said they had even looked directly into the field. But Jaclyn hadn't been seen then, which meant one of two things had to be true. Either her body had somehow been missed, or it had been placed there later. An autopsy was performed later that day, and what it revealed only deepened the confusion. Jaclyn Dowaliby had been strangled. There were no defensive wounds on her hands, no scratches, no signs that she had fought back. To investigators, that suggested something unsettling. Either Jaclyn had been unconscious when she was killed, or she had known the person who was with her. There were no signs of sexual assault, no evidence that pointed to a random predator. And there was another detail that stood out. Jaclyn's body temperature indicated she had died several hours after she was last seen alive. That meant she hadn't been killed immediately after being taken. She had been kept somewhere, alive. Where that place was, and who she was with, were questions the evidence refused to answer. Instead of slowing things down, this uncertainty pushed the investigation in a very specific direction. Not toward the unknown, but back toward the people who had last seen her alive. Jaclyn's parents were brought in for questioning later that day. At first, the interviews were routine. They were asked to walk investigators through the night. What time Jaclyn went to bed? who checked on her last, what they heard or didn't hear while they slept. Their answers stayed consistent. They said Jaclyn had been put to bed, that nothing seemed out of the ordinary, that they woke up to find her gone. But consistency didn't bring relief. It raised suspicion. Detectives began asking the same questions again, and then again, each time listening not for new information, but for mistakes. Small details were challenged. Time estimates, word choices, pauses. What had started as an interview slowly became something else. The assumption wasn't that the parents were grieving. It was that they were lying, and just hadn't been caught yet. From that moment on, the investigation stopped asking who did this, and started asking, how did they get away with it? As the investigation continued, the case began to attract attention outside the police department. News crews arrived in Midlothian. Reporters gathered near the Dowaliby home. Neighbors watched from their windows. The story was simple and unsettling. A child was taken from her bedroom. Her body was found nearby, and there were no suspects. In cases like that, pressure builds quickly, not just to solve the crime, but to close it. Investigators began leaking details to the media. Small inconsistencies, unverified impressions, nothing concrete, but enough to shape public opinion. Whispers started to spread. Why didn't the parents hear anything? Why was there no forced entry? Why did their stories sound rehearsed? The narrative was forming before the evidence was. And once a narrative takes hold, every new detail gets filtered through it. By the time detectives returned to the Dowaliby home, they weren't looking for answers. They were looking for confirmation. With no physical evidence pointing outside the home, investigators began re-examining everything connected to Jaclyn's parents. Not to eliminate them, but to build a case around them. Normal behavior was reinterpreted. Emotions were measured. Grief was judged. If they were calm, it looked suspicious. If they were emotional, it looked performative. And then came the so-called evidence. Fibers from the Dowaliby home were said to be consistent with fibers found on Jaclyn's clothing. The statement sounded scientific, convincing, but it didn't mean what people thought it meant. The fibers were common household material, the kind found in countless homes, the kind that couldn't place a person at a crime scene, because the crime scene was the home itself. Still, the detail was repeated. In reports, in briefings, in the media, it became a fact through repetition. And once that happened, everything else was treated as background noise. Not long after the fiber evidence was presented, investigators made their decision. Jaclyn Dowaliby's parents were arrested. The announcement came before any new forensic breakthrough, before any eyewitnesses, before any confession. But by then, the case already felt solved. The arrests were framed as progress, as closure. Press conferences were held. Statements were released. What wasn't addressed were the questions that still had no answers. How Jaclyn had been taken from the house, without waking anyone, where she had been kept for hours, and why no physical evidence placed either parent at the field where she was found. Those gaps didn't slow the case down. They were treated as obstacles that would be resolved later, at trial. From that moment on, the goal was no longer to discover what happened. It was to prove what had already been decided. When the case went to trial, prosecutors didn't present a clear sequence of events. They presented a story. It was built around implication rather than evidence, around what must have happened, because nothing else made sense to them. They told jurors that Jaclyn had been killed inside the home, that her body had later been moved to the field, but they couldn't say when, or how, or by whom. Instead, they focused on behavior. They pointed to the parents' demeanor, their emotional reactions, the way they answer questions. They returned again and again to the fibers, repeating the claim that they were consistent. The phrase sounded precise, scientific, but no expert testified that those fibers were unique, or that they could identify a specific person. What the prosecution offered wasn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It was a theory, presented with confidence, and confidence, in a courtroom, can be mistaken for certainty. The defense faced a problem that had nothing to do with evidence. They were responding to a story that had already settled in the jurors' minds. Instead of presenting an alternative explanation, they were forced into a weaker position, trying to poke holes in the prosecution's version. They challenged the fiber analysis, pointed out its lack of specificity, but without a clear suspect outside the family. Those challenges sounded abstract. The defense had no dramatic reveal, no single moment that reset the room. And in cases involving a child, The emotional gravity is hard to overcome. Jurors weren't just weighing facts. They were searching for reassurance, for a way to make sense of something senseless. The prosecution offered certainty. The defense offered doubt. In theory, doubt should be enough. But in that courtroom, certainty felt safer. By the time closing arguments ended, the outcome no longer depended on what was proven, but on which version of events. After days of testimony, the jury reached a decision. Jaclyn Dowaliby's parents were found guilty. The verdict landed with finality, not just in the courtroom, but everywhere the case had already taken root. For prosecutors, it was validation. For investigators, confirmation. For the public, it was closure. The narrative they had been given now had the authority of a jury behind it. Sentencing followed. Years of prison time were imposed. And with that, the case was declared solved. No further searches were conducted. No alternate suspects pursued. The unanswered questions remained unanswered. But they no longer mattered. Because once a verdict is reached, the system moves on. And when the system moves on, reconsidering the truth becomes someone else's problem. After days of testimony, the jury reached a decision. Jaclyn Dowaliby's parents were found guilty. The verdict landed with finality, not just in the courtroom, but everywhere the case had already taken root. For prosecutors, it was validation. For investigators, confirmation. For the public, it was closure. The narrative they had been given now had the authority of a jury behind it. Sentencing followed. Years of prison time were imposed. And with that, the case was declared solved. No further searches were conducted. No alternate suspects pursued. The unanswered questions remained unanswered. But they no longer mattered. Because once a verdict is reached, the system moves on. And when the system moves on, reconsidering the truth becomes someone else's problem. When the appellate court issued its ruling, it did more than question minor details. It dismantled the foundation of the conviction. The judges ruled that critical testimony presented at trial had gone beyond what the science could actually support. Statements described as definitive were, in reality, interpretive. The fiber evidence, the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, was determined to have been overstated. The court found that the jury had been given a stronger impression of certainty than the evidence justified. And that matters, because in a criminal trial, the difference between possible and proven is everything. The convictions were reversed. After years under the weight of a guilty verdict, Jaclyn's parents were released. Legally, the case was no longer closed. But reversal is not the same as resolution. It didn't answer who killed Jaclyn. It only confirmed that the answer, presented to the jury, had not been reliable. When a conviction is overturned, the case doesn't disappear. Prosecutors are given a choice. They can retry the case, or they can let it go. In Jaclyn Dowaliby's case, the state initially signaled it was prepared to try again. Publicly, officials maintained confidence in their original theory. But behind the scenes, the situation had changed. The strongest forensic claims had already been weakened. Witness credibility had been questioned. And time had passed. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Jurors grow more skeptical of cases built on interpretation. Retrying the case would mean presenting it again, without the certainty that had once secured a conviction. Eventually, prosecutors dismissed the charges. Not because the mystery was solved, not because another suspect had been identified, but because the case, as constructed, could no longer meet the burden of proof. Legally, Jaclyn's parents were free, but legally free is not the same as publicly cleared. When the charges were dismissed, the legal battle ended, but the public memory did not. For many people, the original conviction never disappeared. Headlines linger longer than corrections. Even after release, suspicion followed Jaclyn's parents. In interviews, they maintained their innocence. They insisted the system had made a catastrophic mistake. But proving innocence is harder than overturning a conviction. The state no longer pursued them, yet it never identified another suspect. The field where Jaclyn was found remained just a field. The house where she slept remained just a house. No new forensic breakthrough emerged. No confession surfaced. And with time, the case drifted from urgency into unresolved history. A child had been killed. 2 parents had been convicted. The convictions were reversed. But the central question, who took Jaclyn from her bedroom, remained unanswered. Even with the parents released, Jaclyn's disappearance remained unsolved. Investigators returned to the same questions. How did she leave her bedroom unnoticed? Where was she held before the field? And most importantly, who had taken her? Every lead ran cold. Every tip was dead end. Theories emerged, some plausible, others far-fetched. Neighbors whispered about strangers in the area. Friends recalled moments that suddenly seemed suspicious. The case had become a collection of possibilities, rather than certainties. And the more time passed, the harder it became to distinguish memory from speculation. For Jaclyn's family, the wound remained open. For the public, the story became legend, an unresolved tragedy frozen in time. Every unanswered question hung in the air, and would remain there for decades. Over time, the case of Jaclyn Dowaliby changed, not in facts, but in how it was remembered. For some, it remained a solved case that had been undone by technicalities. For others, it became an example of a system that had moved too quickly and reached the wrong conclusion. Two versions of the same story, existing side by side, and without a definitive answer. Both were allowed to survive. The details faded, dates blurred, but the outline stayed the same. A child taken from her bedroom, a body found nearby, a conviction, a reversal, and a question that refused to go away. In cases like this, time doesn't bring clarity. It creates distance. And distance doesn't resolve uncertainty. It preserves it. In everything that followed, the investigation, the trial, the appeals, it's easy to lose sight of the one person this case was always about. Jaclyn Dowaliby was 4 years old. She didn't leave behind a complicated history. No long timeline. No series of events to analyze. Just a short life, interrupted without explanation. The conversations that surround cases like this often become about systems, about mistakes, about who was right and who was wrong. But underneath all of that is a simpler truth. A child was taken from her home, and no one has ever been held responsible. With certainty, that's what remains. Not the arguments, not the legal outcomes, just the absence of an answer, where one should exist. After everything that's been said, everything that's been argued, everything that's been decided and then undone, one question still remains. Who took Jaclyn Dowaliby from her bedroom that night? Not in theory, not in speculation, but in fact, because somewhere between the moment she was last seen and the moment she was found, something happened that has never been fully explained. And every conclusion that followed was built on trying to fill that gap, some with certainty, some with doubt, but none with an answer that held. The investigation moved forward. The system reached a verdict. The verdict was reversed. And still, that central moment remains untouched, unseen, unproven.